Hello everybody, my name is Rosie Ruiz and today we're going to go over some of the literary forms. So these literary forms are going to help us go in more in depth into our literature and help us understand why authors chose these forms in their writing. So the learning objectives of this presentation are you will be able to define the word literary forms and the genres. We want to be able to explain differences between genres and literary forms. We will also focus on some similarities, but it's mostly going to be the differences. I want you guys to be able to explain and discuss different types of literary forms, and lastly, list characteristics of specific literary forms in literature. Okay, so this is some key vocabulary that you guys should all have down by the end of this presentation. So some of the words we're going to learn today are literary form, genre, poetry, epic poetry, lyric, romance, satire, short story, and novel. So we're going to be going a lot of these throughout the course, so I want you guys to be familiar with their characteristics and how they are involved in the writing that we are going through. All right, so first of all, what is a literary form? A form is a piece of writing simply in its structure or how it's constructed and organized. Literary forms are like roots of the literary family tree, while the genres are like the branches off the family tree. It branches off. A genre is a specific style or category of writing. Genres make use of the various literary forms as foundations from which to stretch out in many directions of expression. Forms and genres join with content to create the meaning of a piece of drawing. So forms and genres kind of intertwine together. They're not the same thing, but they are very similar. So I want you guys to have these literary forms down. There's also going to be a video linked on one of the assignments I gave you guys, and that's going to have more in depth of this topic. So here's a little visual. So okay, the form is the structure and how it's organized, and then you can see how it branches off into the genre. And if you want to go more in depth, it goes further on into the branches and the meaning. So the meaning would be up here. All right, so now we're going to go into our first literary form, which is poetry. So poetry usually communicates through linguistic imagery, figurative language, sounds of words, and arithmetic quality. Poetry and poems are some of the oldest forms of literature and date back to ancient Greece. I'm pretty sure some of you guys have seen poetry somewhere or another. I mean, it's pretty much in all of the literature books that you have read so far, so you should have seen some poetry. Poetry is often associated with rhyming, which is very common, but some poems do not rhyme. So here's an example of a poetry that I chose, and it's going to be the Japanese haiku. Let's talk a little about the haiku. The haiku is a poem that consists of 3 lines. So it has 5 syllables in the middle and 7 syllables, and it usually does not rhyme. So here's an example: the old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. So if you could see, it's 3 lines. It consists of 5 syllables at the top and bottom, and then 7 in the middle, but it does not rhyme. We're going to go over the more in depth of this when we enter our poetry unit. All right, next one. So epic poetry is another form of poetry. So this poetry is seen more as a long narrative poem. It's usually about a single heroic person. Epics have monumental sweep and embrace the essence of an entire nation. They also frequently include mythical forces that influence the inevitable battles and conflicts. So an example of an epic is the Odyssey and the Iliad, written by Homer. So here's the book right here. So this epic embraces a Greek national theme. All right, so that's epic poetry. Next, we're going to talk about the lyric. So the lyric is related to the epic, but it is shorter and presents more profound feelings or ideas. So the term lyric, it comes in terms with elegy and odes, but both refer to lyric. Some authors call it elegy or ode. It's just common names that we hear a lot. So the word lyric comes from the Latin word meaning lyricus, and it means of or for, the lyre. So these short poems are originally accompanied by music. Some of the best examples of lyric poetry come from Italian and English sonnets. So here's a sonnet that I chose to write down for you guys. It's the Dirge by William Shakespeare. So this is an example of epic poetry. A lot of Shakespeare's writing is composed in the lyric form. All right, so now let's go into romance. So romance literature may be referred to medieval romance literature, and it's also a style of heroic prose and verse narrative that's current in Europe from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. So obviously the romance, I mean, as you guys could imagine, it's more romantic. It involves chivalry and courtly love, comprising stories and legends of duty, courage, boldness, battles, and rescues of damsels and distress. So an example of romantic literature would be this story called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's a really popular form of literature that we'll be going more into depth later on in the class. All right, next one. So we're going to go over satire. So satire exposes the frailty of the human condition through wit, irony, mockery, sarcasm, and ridicule. So satire is a technique employed by writers to expose and criticize foolish and corruption of an individual or society by using humor, irony, exaggeration. And it intends to improve humanity by criticizing its follies and foibles. Okay, so an example of a satire is this story called Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. It's one of the older ones. There's many popular satires out there. I'm pretty sure you guys have heard of some, but this is just one example. Okay, now for short stories, they're my favorite. So short stories is a short fictional piece, usually with a single theme. And it's prose fiction that typically can be read in one sitting and focuses on self-contained incident or a series of linked incidents with the intent of evoking an effect or a mood. Okay, so some examples of short stories are The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, and also some stories from O. Henry. So some of these famous writers who were some of the reasons they penned short stories in the late 1800s and 1900s, and they're the most popular, some of the most popular writers during this era. Okay, and lastly, we're going to go over novels. So the novel is a fictional story that depicts characters and a plot. A novel can be characterized as a fictitious prose narrative of book length, typically representing character and action with some degree of realism. So the first novels were written during the Renaissance. And then here are some examples that I put down. So The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. So both of these novels focus on social ills. All right, so now that we have all these literary forms down, I want you guys to write down this discussion question and think about it clearly. We're going to just discuss tomorrow, so I want you guys to choose one literary form, whichever one you want. It could only be one. And find some research, go into Google, type in different examples that interest you. So I just don't want you guys to use some of the examples I already gave you guys. So I talked about a lot of for example, I talked about Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, so you wouldn't be able to choose that anymore because I already chose it. So find a different example of the form you chose, and I want you to write a short synopsis on this literature example and describe what characteristics makes it that literary form. So this only has to be about 1 to 2 paragraphs long, not very long. I mean, something that you could just briefly discuss in class. So hope you guys do find some good research, and I'm excited to see what you guys have down. See you guys all tomorrow.